Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Beyond Uncertainty series of conversations from the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. My name is Yauheni Preiherman, and today we'll be trying to understand whether the Russia-US security talks have failed and what to expect under several hypothetical scenarios. Last week, I spoke to Pavel Charap about Russia's security proposals and the diplomatic engagements addressing those proposals. Please check out the conversation on our YouTube channel if you haven't done so. Since we recorded the previous episode, one more round of talks has taken place in Geneva, where the Russian and US delegations headed by their top diplomats once again addressed Moscow's security concerns and demands, as well as American counterconcerns. And then this week has already seen a further hardening of rhetoric and various political and military moves, which, as some analysts maintain, are further increasing the likelihood of a major crisis. To discuss these developments, I'm honored and delighted to be joined by a good friend and one of the most authoritative voices on all things Russia and on European security, Dr. Samuel Charap. Sam is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and, very, very importantly, a member of the Minsk Dialogue's Advisory Council. Let's begin with a brief assessment of where we are at the moment. Will it be correct to say that in Act 1, diplomacy has failed and we are now doomed to see military escalation leading to a major crisis in what can be called an Act 2?
Well, I don't think anything is fated or inevitable at this point. I think that Russia's use of, or threats of use of military force are clearly intended to achieve political objectives. And if they could get some of what they want or what they want without war, I think they would take it. The question is really whether there is the prospect for any coming together of positions of the sides, which now appear to be quite diametrically opposed. So it's an open question about whether this diplomacy has been conducted in good faith, and we can talk about that a little bit too. But I don't think we've necessarily come to a point where we can conclude definitively that diplomacy is over, war is inevitable. That said, the risks are growing, and the diplomatic track has yet to substantively change the dynamic on the ground that we've been seeing now for the last couple months, which is the sort of buildup, an unprecedented buildup on all sides of Ukraine, essentially, perhaps with the exception of the Western side, and the threat posed by this group of Russian forces that's accumulating along the borders.
Just to briefly touch up upon what you mentioned, whether diplomacy did perform well. So did it?
So this is a very odd diplomatic case, let's put it that way. First, starting from the beginning, the Russian proposals coming, more or less out of nowhere, when first Putin gave the speech to the assembled diplomatic corps in November and surprised everyone, including the ambassadors and senior diplomats in the audience, when he said we need, legally binding security guarantees from NATO. And then, to a certain extent, it seemed somewhat improvised and unclear the extent to which it's a genuine initiative that if there were to be some bargaining would, we could end up with a solution that avoids conflict, or whether it's some sort of delaying tactic or, about creating a pretext for conflict. It's not exactly clear. And to be also, honest. It's strange that it's unusual that the Russians made their proposals public so soon after presenting them to US and NATO officials. So I think it's an open question about whether diplomacy ever had a chance. Now, that all having been said, after that initial publication of those documents, it seems that Russia's been focused on three major issues. Non-enlargement of NATO being the sort of first and central one. The question of missile deployments to Europe. And the third, which they framed in terms of returning NATO forces to their 1997 configuration, which I would reframe as sort of like the question of US and NATO military presence east of Germany. Well, let me put it this way. The US has already sort of partially offered to address the second two, and which has sort of gone unnoticed. We haven't talked about deployments, and we haven't talked about it in the terms of 1997 or whatever, but the US has put on the table discussions about limiting exercises near the Russian-NATO frontier, and it has talked about the, engaging on the proposed INF moratorium, INF range missile deployment moratorium the Russians have put on the table. It's the first issue that really seems to be the major stumbling block, if this is actual diplomacy and not sort of theater. And that issue, is a tragic one from my perspective, because Russia is essentially demanding that NATO not do something that it has no intention of doing, which is offering Ukraine a membership track. But precisely because Russia is demanding it, it's nearly impossible for NATO to say that publicly. So we're stuck with this 2008 Bucharest summit declaration language of Ukraine and Georgia will become, quote unquote, members of NATO, when in reality, that is just, there isn't a process to back that up, and there's no intention of moving towards that kind of a process. So in some way, being able to address that without undoing the open door policy or the, core Washington Treaty premise that European states can that contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area can apply, and allies can decide if they want to take in new members. Russia can't get a never ever ever as they're asking for, but they could get a statement of the reality that that is not on the table right now, or I would hope at least. Anyway, I think that issue, if we're able to find, if Western governments are able to find some creative way of addressing it without crossing red lines, I think that would be quite a help. Of course, the Ukrainians themselves have a major role to play here. They've been on this issue quite hardline, pushing for sort of a no compromises. And that makes it much harder for the US and other Western governments to engage on this issue, even though it is their prerogative to decide, who gets a membership offer and who doesn't. Ukraine has the right to aspire to that, but ultimately it's NATO decides who becomes a member of NATO or not.
But is it fair to say that the Russian ultimatum has already sort of succeeded in propelling a qualitative turn in American, at least expert discourse on NATO expansion? I mean, sometimes what you read these days does remind of that discussion back in the mid-1990s, where some big voices like Canada would be, warning against a big strategic mistake with further NATO expansion. I know I'm exaggerating it a little bit at this point, but do you think this qualitative turn is really about to happen and might have been propelled by the Russian ultimatum?
To a certain extent, yes. I think there was an extent to which this line about Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO has been, a festering problem for a long time. And so, yes, I think that Russia's demands have sharpened this discussion and made it more perhaps allowed for more of a discussion of alternatives. But even, going back to the summer, summer of 2021, I remember President Biden being asked at NATO, at the NATO summit about Ukraine's membership prospects, and he said, well, they're not ready yet. And this keeps coming up in part because the Ukrainians keep, raising it as their, desired outcome. So it didn't come out of nowhere, but yes, I do think that, to a certain extent, we're having a conversation in Western capitals that we might not have been having before. And that does, not everyone likes the fact that we're having this conversation at all. And a lot of people don't like that we're having it because Russia has coerced us into having it. But let's be honest, this is, the equivalent, the international political equivalent of extortion, right? Like Russia's posing quite a threat and saying, we're going to follow through on this unless. And, it's unpleasant. And, you could just think about it from the other side. Russia doesn't like backing down under pressure. Neither does the US or other major NATO countries. There's an interesting also asymmetry here between the subject of the threat and the subject of the ultimatum, right? So Russia's posing a threat to Ukraine and demanding things of the US and NATO. That also creates, challenging asymmetries because the direct consequences won't be felt by the countries from which Russia is demanding concessions right now. So there's a short-term political price to be paid for concessions by Western governments. And if you have just the slightest doubt that maybe Russia's bluffing and you're a Western policymaker, if your choice is between compromising and taking a certain political hit versus not compromising and maybe avoiding any political backlash, or maybe avoiding, having a much bigger one, but it's uncertain. I think the sort of small c conservative tendency would be to, avoid the certain cost rather than embrace the, uncertain consequences of potential future Russian actions.
So why don't we discuss very briefly a few hypothetical scenarios and what they might result in on the ground? I know that the US State Department reportedly considered 18 scenarios for what Washington can do in response to all sorts of Russian actions and whether Russia invades Ukraine. We are not as ambitious as the State Department, of course. So we'll try to go through just 3 scenarios. At least I offer those for your consideration. Then, if you want to talk a little bit about another one, that's also great. So, what if Russia does launch an attack on Ukraine? What are the US and NATO likely to do in that case, and what are their actions likely to lead to on the ground?
If there is a full-fledged Russian attack would be without any degree of ambiguity. I think the Western governments have telegraphed a lot of what they're going to do. They're going to impose unprecedented economic sanctions. They're going to up military assistance to the Ukrainians. They're going to, reinforce Eastern flank allies. And I think that is pretty clear. I think the US and the EU have had enough time now to sort of pre-cook sanctions options and probably agree on them. And my sense is that if Russia does this, it's not going to be ambiguous. So there wouldn't be the opportunity for for a country that's hesitant to say, well, maybe this was, not as significant as we thought it was going to be. I get the sense that the Russians are going to go big or go home, as we say here. And then the question is, how does Russia respond to that? And here, is where we get into some quite speculative thinking, but nonetheless something that I think should be on all of our minds, which is, could this spiral? Do the Russians just take this, unprecedented sanctions response and do nothing? That seems unlikely. So I know you don't want to get too far down the road, but I think the answer to your immediate question is that we have a pretty good idea about what Western governments will do, and what they won't do, which is deploy their own military to counter the Russian potential Russian attack.
But what will all this mean for the European security architecture then? So does it mean that the very talk about some kind of architecture which will be to Russia's liking will immediately be over, or will it still, promote in a way a more rational discussion like what Moscow claims it wants to get, even after some Russian troops might find themselves on the Russian territory?
If Russia really invades and deposes the elected government in Ukraine through military means, the European security architecture as it is will have been shattered. The OSCE and all of its attendant documents will basically be, a historical footnote. And we're looking at a new era of confrontation. This is not what the US wants to do, but it would be forced to redeploy significant military assets to Europe. Because this just as the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass in 2014 raised fears about Russia potentially doing something vis-a-vis NATO countries along their periphery, this would, amplify that tenfold. So it's hard for me to imagine getting to a rational place if Russia were to proceed.
Let's look at scenario number two, which in my view would be much more typical of Putin's thinking and acting. So what if instead of a military campaign against Ukraine, Russia goes for creating a direct military threat to the US, say by ensuring that some sort of most advanced weapons it has get closer to the American territory? What's US military and diplomatic reactions likely to be then?
So interestingly, Russia has, there has been sporadic talk about deployment of forces to or missiles to, be it Cuba or Venezuela. I have my doubts about this, for a couple of reasons. One, it's hard for Russia to support overseas deployments that far away from its own territory. Two, we've seen no sign of it yet, and the US would be looking out for it quite closely. And I have a feeling that whatever the government knows would leak quite quickly. And three, this huge buildup around Ukraine is a deliberate act, right? And then to just sort of leave all these tens of thousands of soldiers there and try to create a crisis halfway across the world, it seems, I don't know. So, and the other major reason, I guess, is that I don't think Putin wants a Russia-US conflict out of this. I think he wants Ukraine. Ukraine, European security, and the US role in Europe are all kind of tied up together.
Okay, and now my favorite scenario. So what if nothing happens now? Can this very emotional stress that we're observing on all sides make those sides more inclined to compromise without a major crisis? Or do you think we're still doomed for a major crisis at some point in future?
So nothing happens. That means no military action, right? And so the only two ways we get to that, it would seem to me, is we get a deal or Russia goes home empty-handed. I would exclude the second option. I think they've raised the stakes so high now that going home empty-handed is not going to happen. And therefore, the only way nothing happens militarily is if there's a deal. I don't think it's impossible at this point that there could be a deal, but I think the chances of that are decreasing by the day. And precisely because it's impossible for the US and NATO and the West more broadly to take, not to respond to Russian actions while also trying to engage in diplomacy, that, I think the incentives for de-escalation, as they say, are decreasing as time goes on, and the sort of logic of escalation ends up taking over. So this would be my favorite scenario too, but at this point, you have to be able to describe a pathway to a deal, and at this point, I can't see it. That's what makes me concerned about this, about this crisis more broadly and the potential implications.
And to conclude with all our attempts to look a little bit beyond uncertainty, what do you think is most likely to happen in the weeks or months to come?
Well, I guess I'm on the record as saying this, so I'll say it again, which is that I think at this point, I would put the probability of Russian military action at over 50%, 60-40 maybe. As I said, three broad sets of outcomes, right? There's some deal, there's a Russian military action, or there is a Russian retreat, right? I think we can exclude the retreat without, any concessions. It's hard to see the pathway to the deal. And so this one, this option of Russian military action, or this scenario, ends up seeming the most plausible of the three at this point. I certainly hope that that's not the case, that it doesn't turn out that way, but analytically, I can't but, reach that judgment that it seems more likely than the other two.
Perhaps you could summarize your recommendations for the US government at this point, not sort of in general, not in the longer term, but given where we are and what today's challenges and basically threats are.
I think we should be doing whatever it takes to avoid this war. And, obviously short of compromising our principles or our interests. And it would seem to me that we need to, the US government needs to try to pursue diplomacy as energetically as possible. I mean, my suggestion would be at this point that diplomacy can really only be effective if it's conducted on the president-to-president level. We don't have time for a diplomatic process right now. So, we should have not necessarily a negotiation, but like an offer made by the president, delivered to President Putin, and see what can come of that.
Well, thank you, Sam, and let's hope that something like this happens, and at least when this recording is out, we will still have chances for a peaceful solution of this, very dramatic and historically unpredictable situation. Thank you.